The screams echoed through Berkeley Castle's stone corridors on that September night in 1327. They were not the cries of battle or celebration, but something far more terrible. Something that would haunt the pages of history for 7 centuries. A king lay dying in the darkness below, not from sword or poison, but from an act so brutal, so deliberately crafted to destroy both body and soul, that chroniclers would struggle to record it. The man who had once commanded armies, who had worn the crown of England for 20 years, was meeting an end designed to mock everything he had ever been. But here's what will shock you. The most famous story of Edward II's death, the red-hot poker thrust into his bowels, may be nothing more than medieval propaganda. The real story of his final hours is far stranger, more complex, and infinitely more tragic than the legend suggests. Born at Caernarfon Castle in 1284, Edward II was everything a medieval king was not supposed to be. While his father, Edward I Longshanks, had been the hammer of the Scots, young Edward preferred the company of laborers to lords, delighting in rowing boats and thatching roofs rather than planning conquests. Contemporary chroniclers paint a picture of a king who defied every convention of his time. The Vita Edwardi Secundi records that he took too much delight in sodomy, while others noted his unusual friendships with men far beneath his station. His relationship with Piers Gaveston, a Gascon knight's son, scandalized the nobility not merely for its intimate nature, but for how it elevated a commoner to unprecedented power. By 1327, Edward's 20-year reign had become a catalogue of disasters. The humiliating defeat at Bannockburn in 1314 had secured Scottish independence. His obsession with male favorites, first Gaveston, then Hugh Despenser the Younger, had alienated his barons and, ultimately, his own wife. Queen Isabella of France, once called the fairest of the fair, had become his most dangerous enemy. The scope of Edward's downfall would reshape the very nature of English kingship, establishing the first precedent for royal deposition in English history. The Golden Moment. Edward II in his prime was tall, strong, and undeniably handsome, standing in the Great Hall of Westminster Palace. In February 1308, he was crowned King of England. The ceremony itself had been magnificent, conducted in French rather than Latin for the first time, with his new bride Isabella watching from the gallery. But even in this moment of triumph, the seeds of destruction were already planted. While nobles and foreign dignitaries celebrated, Edward spent the coronation feast laughing and whispering with Piers Gaveston, ignoring his 12-year-old queen and her French relatives. The insult was deliberate, public, and unforgivable. Edward's world in those early years was one of unprecedented royal luxury. He had inherited the most powerful kingdom in Europe, with vast territories stretching from the Scottish borders to the Pyrenees. His court was filled with music, pageantry, and the kind of elaborate entertainments that Gaveston excelled at organizing. The king delighted in men like satyrs grazing on the lawns, as one contemporary put it, creating an atmosphere of sensual indulgence that shocked even the permissive standards of medieval nobility. Yet beneath this glittering surface, Edward was already making the choices that would doom him. His elevation of Gaveston to Earl of Cornwall, a title traditionally reserved for royal blood, sent shockwaves through the aristocracy. When he appointed his favorite as regent while traveling to France for his wedding, the message was clear. This low-born Gascon held more power than earls whose families had served the crown for generations. The foreshadowing was everywhere, had Edward chosen to see it. The barons' faces grew darker with each honor heaped upon Gaveston. The Scottish raids grew bolder as Edward neglected his military duties. And in France, Isabella's father, King Philip IV, watched his daughter's humiliation with growing anger. The turning point. The moment everything changed came not with a single dramatic event, but through a series of escalating confrontations that revealed Edward's fatal inability to understand the limits of royal power. In 1311, the barons forced him to accept the ordinances, a document that stripped away many of his prerogatives and demanded Gaveston's permanent exile. Edward's response was characteristic. He pretended to comply while secretly planning defiance. He sent Gaveston to Ireland as lieutenant, technically fulfilling the letter of the exile while keeping his favorite within reach. But the barons had learned not to trust their king's word. The pivotal moment came in June 1312 at a place called Blacklow Hill. Gaveston, captured by the Earl of Warwick, was dragged from Dedington Castle to face a tribunal of his enemies. There was no trial, no ceremony, just the swift justice of men who had reached the end of their patience. They ran him through with a sword, then beheaded him for good measure. When news reached Edward, witnesses reported that the king wept openly, keeping Gaveston's body close for weeks before the church forced a burial. The man who had shared his bed, his throne, and his dreams was gone, and with him died any hope of reconciliation with the nobility. From this moment, Edward's reign became a death spiral. He transferred his obsessive affection to Hugh Despenser the Younger, a man even more grasping and unpopular than Gaveston had been. The pattern repeated itself with tragic inevitability: royal favoritism, baronial outrage, and escalating conflict that would ultimately consume the kingdom. The psychological toll on Edward was visible to all who knew him. The playful, if irresponsible, young king hardened into something darker, a man driven by grief and an unquenchable thirst for revenge against those who had destroyed his beloved Gaveston. The Descent. By 1320, Edward's England had become a kingdom at war with itself. The king's elevation of the Despensers had created a tyranny more oppressive than anything his father had imposed on Wales or Scotland. Hugh Despenser the Younger, now royal chamberlain, used his position to seize lands, manipulate the courts, and eliminate rivals with ruthless efficiency. The breaking point came when Despenser demanded the lordship of Gower in Wales, a territory that legally belonged to another. When Edward simply confiscated it and handed it over, he violated centuries of feudal law. The message was clear: the king's will, guided by his favorite's greed, now trumped all legal precedent. The response was swift and devastating. Led by Roger Mortimer and the Marcher Lords, a coalition of barons rose in rebellion. They captured the Despensers' lands, declared them enemies of the realm, and forced Edward to exile them just as he had Gaveston years before. But Edward had learned from his earlier mistake. Instead of accepting defeat, he recalled the Despensers and raised an army. The civil war that followed was brief but decisive. At Boroughbridge in March 1322, royal forces crushed the rebellion. Thomas of Lancaster, Edward's own cousin and the leader of the opposition, was captured and executed. For a moment, it seemed Edward had won. He dissolved the ordinances, restored royal power, and began a systematic persecution of his enemies. But victory had come at a terrible price. The king's reputation was in ruins, his treasury empty, and his kingdom exhausted by years of internal conflict. Worse still, his treatment of the Despensers had finally alienated the one person whose support he could not afford to lose: his wife. Queen Isabella, humiliated by Despenser's control over her household and denied access to her own children, began to plot her revenge. The isolation was complete. Edward, surrounded by the Despensers and their creatures, had become a prisoner in his own palace, cut off from the very people whose loyalty he needed to survive. The Climax. September 1326 brought the reckoning Edward had been fleeing for 20 years. Isabella landed at Orwell with a small army, accompanied by her lover Roger Mortimer and her teenage son, the future Edward III. What followed was not so much an invasion as a collapse. Edward's support simply evaporated as nobles, clergy, and common people flocked to the Queen's banner. The king's flight was a masterpiece of medieval humiliation. Abandoning London, he fled west with the Despensers, desperately seeking refuge in Wales, where Hugh the Younger's power was strongest. But even there, support melted away. Welsh lords who had served the Despensers for years now turned against them, sensing the shift in fortune. The end came near L'Entresant in November 1326. Edward and Hugh Despenser the Younger were captured by Henry of Lancaster, the brother of the man Edward had executed 4 years earlier. The irony was perfect. The king who had shown no mercy would receive none in return. Hugh Despenser the Elder was taken at Bristol and hanged immediately, his body fed to dogs. But for the younger Despenser, Isabella had planned something special. Dragged to Hereford, he was subjected to the full horror of a traitor's death. Hanged until nearly dead, castrated while still conscious, disemboweled, and finally beheaded. The crowd that gathered to watch numbered in the thousands. Edward was forced to witness his favorite's destruction before being led away to captivity. The man who had once commanded the loyalty of millions was now a prisoner, dependent on his captor's mercy for his very survival. On January 20th, 1327, in the Great Hall of Kenilworth Castle, Edward II formally abdicated his throne. The charges read against him were devastating: incompetence, allowing others to govern him, losing Scotland and Gascony, damaging the church, and fleeing with a notorious enemy of the realm. As the crown was taken from his head and given to his 14-year-old son, Edward wept openly. "I greatly lament that I have utterly failed my people," he said, "but I could not be other than I am." The mystery of Berkeley Castle. What happened next has puzzled historians for 7 centuries. Edward was moved to Berkeley Castle in Gloucestershire, where he was placed under the custody of Thomas Berkeley and John Maltravers, men with every reason to hate him. The official story is simple. On September 21st, 1327, the former king died in his cell. But the details of that death have never been clear. Contemporary chroniclers offered wildly different accounts. Adam Murimuth, writing closest to the events, said Edward was popularly rumored to have been suffocated. The Lichfield Chronicle suggested strangulation. Most sources simply stated he died of natural causes or grief. The famous red-hot poker story didn't appear until the 1340s, in the longer version of the Brute Chronicle. According to this account, Edward was held down by a heavy table while assassins inserted a red-hot copper spit through a horn into his bowels, burning his internal organs while leaving no external marks. But here's where the story becomes truly extraordinary. Significant evidence suggests Edward II never died at Berkeley Castle at all. In 1330, 3 years after the supposed death, Edward's half-brother Edmund, Earl of Kent, was executed for treason. His crime? Attempting to rescue Edward II from Corfe Castle, where Kent believed he was being held alive. Kent wasn't alone in this belief. The Archbishop of York, the Bishop of London, and numerous other influential figures were convinced the former king had survived. Even more intriguing is the Fieschi letter, written around 1337 by Manuela Fieschi, a papal notary who claimed to have met Edward in Italy. According to Fieschi, Edward had escaped from Berkeley by switching clothes with a servant, killing the gatekeeper, and fleeing to Corfe Castle. From there, he supposedly traveled to Ireland, then to the continent, eventually ending his days as a hermit near Milan. The letter contains details that few people could have known, and Fieschi was a well-documented historical figure with connections to England. Most remarkably, in 1338, Edward III met with a man called William the Welshman in Germany, who claimed to be his father. Instead of having the pretender executed, Edward III paid his expenses for 3 weeks. The truth behind the legend. So what really happened to Edward II? The evidence suggests 3 possibilities, each more fascinating than the last. The first is that Edward died at Berkeley Castle, but not from the red-hot poker. Given Roger Mortimer's known use of sedatives, he had drugged guards during his own escape from the Tower of London. The most likely scenario is that Edward was drugged and then suffocated. This would explain the lack of external wounds and the varying accounts of his death. The second possibility is that Edward was murdered, but the poker story was invented later as propaganda. The sexual nature of the supposed torture was designed to mock Edward's relationships with men, turning his death into a grotesque parody of his life. This would explain why the story didn't appear in chronicles until years later, when it became politically useful to blacken Mortimer's reputation. But the third possibility is the most extraordinary, that Edward II never died at Berkeley Castle at all. The evidence for his survival is circumstantial but compelling. Too many influential people believed he was alive for it to be mere wishful thinking. The Fieschi letter contains details that suggest genuine inside knowledge, and Edward III's behavior toward supposed pretenders was remarkably lenient for a medieval king. If Edward did survive, it would mean that the funeral at Gloucester Cathedral in December 1327 was an elaborate deception. The body that thousands came to view, wrapped in a cerecloth and lying in state, would have been that of someone else, perhaps the gatekeeper Edward supposedly killed during his escape. Edward II was, in many ways, a man born centuries before his time. His preference for the company of common people over nobles, his apparent disregard for traditional masculine roles, and his willingness to elevate merit over birth all mark him as surprisingly modern. Yet these same qualities made him a failure as a medieval king, leading directly to his downfall. As we stand in the ruins of Berkeley Castle today, looking down into the cell where Edward II supposedly met his end, we're confronted with one of history's most enduring mysteries. The stone walls that witnessed those final hours keep their secrets well, offering no answers to the questions that have haunted scholars for 7 centuries. Edward II's death, whether humiliating or heroic, real or fabricated, reminds us that history is written by the victors. But sometimes, if we listen carefully enough, we can still hear the voices of the vanquished calling to us across the darkness of time.